After 2 years of devastating war, Gaza is under a fragile ceasefire. The focus is shifting from conflict to the question of who will shape the post-war order. The United States has moved quickly to take the diplomatic lead. Europe, meanwhile, faces questions about its capacity to influence events on the ground. Aid and reconstruction materials are flowing into Gaza, with much of it coming from the EU, Israel's largest trading partner. Yet despite its economic weight, EU leaders such as Commission President Ursula von der Leyen have struggled to turn resources into political leverage. Internal divisions, reliance on the US, and slow decision-making have limited Europe's role. As Gaza enters a new phase, can Europe convert its potential into real influence, or will it remain in Washington's shadow? Nathalie Tocci is the director of the Institute for International Affairs in Rome. She's a leading voice on EU foreign policy and joins us to discuss Europe's role in the Middle East tonight. Israel's Prime Minister, Nathalie, has said recently that the EU had become irrelevant in the Middle East peace process. How did we get here?
Well, I mean, sort of for once he's right in the sense that it's absolutely correct that Europe has become irrelevant in the Middle East in general. I don't think it's only in the Middle East peace process, given that there isn't really a peace process. But I would say in the Middle East in general, whether this is in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or in the Iran conflict or beyond. So why is this the case? I think that structurally, if we are to go back years or even decades, the European Union has traditionally played second fiddle to the United States in the Middle East. And obviously, as that role has fundamentally transformed, and obviously under the presidency of Donald Trump has become increasingly erratic, basically Europe, and I think this is true for the Middle East, but I think it's also true as well, has essentially lost its North Star, right? I mean, it's kind of lost its bearings. So I think there's a sort of structural reason why we don't play a role in the Middle East. But then I think there's also a deeper reason. And I think that deeper reason is paradoxically exactly the opposite of what the Israeli Prime Minister is implying. I think what he's trying to imply by that irrelevance point is Europe has become irrelevant because it has basically, or it seeks to pressurize Israel. And, you look at obviously what is happening in different European capitals with the protests and, the isolation of Israel. And I think that's what he's trying to get at. I would argue that in a sense, it's exactly the opposite. I mean, the reason why we have become irrelevant in this conflict is because we have not been willing to exert pressure on those players, starting with the Israeli Prime Minister, that do not have any intention of moving towards a peace process, particularly one that actually ends up with a two-state solution. And this is not, in a sense, an opinion. I mean, it is very explicitly what the Israeli government itself says.
I want to look at one of the pressure points that the EU could well use, because they are Israel's biggest trading partner, aren't they? Why has the EU never seriously used this as leverage?
Well, that's the trillion-dollar question, really, isn't it? I mean, in fairness, one could say, well, OK, 2 years on since the war in Gaza began, the European Commission did put on the table at least the proposal to suspend the trade preferences for Israel foreseen in the EU-Israel Association Agreement. We know that that proposal has not seen light of day yet, and it has not seen light of day in particular because 2 large member states, i.e. my own country, Italy, and Germany, have refused to move in this direction, despite the fact that there is actually a majority of member states that would like to move in this direction. Now, obviously now, this whole process has been in many respects upended by the quote-unquote peace plan. And in many respects, I think there are several European governments that feel quite relieved that they may be off the hook. Because, of course, if there is a peace plan being implemented, then the last thing you want to do is exert pressure on those parties that are moving forward towards peace. But actually, this is, in my view, precisely the moment in which we should double down on that pressure. Because, as I said, it's quite obvious that there are very strong incentives not to move forward on the implementation of the plan. And we're hearing the Israeli government being really quite explicit about this. And so, while Europeans probably today feel off the hook, or European governments feel off the hook. As I said, I actually think that it's precisely this that is the moment in which we should make that pressure felt if, and this is the big question, if we want to actually somehow recuperate some kind of role in the region.
Yeah, and that is actually the opinion of the Spanish Prime Minister, for example, who says that now is the time to move forward, yes, but also not forget everything that has transpired in the past 2 years. But I want to ask you this. Could that not also be part of the problem the EU is facing in reclaiming a voice in the conflict and in the region as a whole, this internal division blocking a united policy?
Yes, and that's, of course, traditionally been a problem when it comes to the Middle East and in particular the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Although I should add, there was a time in which this wasn't the case. If you think about the way in which, since the 1982 Venice Declaration through to the early 2000s, actually, the European Union gradually built a consensus not only on a two-state solution, but what it actually meant by a two-state solution. And what we've started seeing really over the course of the last decade and a half, and then obviously this sort of led to the climax over the last 2 years, is that consensus has been fraying. Now, of course, at times division within Europe tends to become a rather lazy explanation as to why things don't move. You can always say, we're not acting because, we're divided. And yet, I think unity is something that can be built. It's something that can be fostered. Let's take another example, the war in Ukraine. Unity is not obvious on the war in Ukraine. Unity is built. Internal pressure points are used, particularly towards those member states that don't want to play ball. So ultimately, I think, yes, obviously there's a picture of division, but the point is that no one is really doing much about it because it's a time very convenient to hide behind division in order to justify passivity.
All right. And I want to take a closer look at that point you just raised. Why has Europe been acting so boldly on Ukraine, despite its divisions, but so timidly on Gaza?
Well, I think that we're tragically long past the stage in which we can make the claim that Europe acted out of values, right? Because obviously, if values was an issue, yes, of course, there's a strong case to be made in the case of Ukraine, but there's an equally strong case to be made as far as Gaza is concerned and the violation of international law there. So I think, let's kind of put, perhaps rather sadly, perhaps even cynically, let's put values in a sense out of the picture. I think the fundamental difference is that in the case of Ukraine, Europeans, or at least a critical mass of Europeans, understand that this is tied to their own security interests. And that is why, despite everything that has been happening, despite the flip-flops, for instance, on the other side of the Atlantic, basically Europeans have stayed the course. When it comes to Gaza, I don't think that interest question is actually understood, in my view, actually rather short-sightedly. Because it obviously is in Europe's interest to play a different kind, a more constructive role, certainly more active role in the Middle East. But, what Nathalie thinks is really neither here nor there. I mean, the point is that obviously the facts demonstrate that security interest question is simply not felt as much as it probably should be.
Yeah. Kaja Kallas says the EU wants to seek a more active role in charting the path for Gaza going forward. But how can the EU, things as they stand right now, redefine its role in the Middle East?
I think in all of these conflicts, the question is, what prices are you actually willing to pay? Because peace is not cheap. Yeah, I mean, we've learned this in the case of Ukraine. It hasn't been cheap to impose almost 19 packages of sanctions on Russia. It hasn't been cheap to support Ukraine financially, militarily, politically, diplomatically, right? It hasn't been cheap. Price or seeking peace comes at a cost. Now, the point is that, when it comes to the Middle East, when it comes to Gaza, we have not been willing to pay that cost. Whether that cost is, ending up at crosshairs with the United States or ending up at crosshairs with Israel, we have simply not been willing to pay that cost. And until we're willing to pay a cost, we simply will not play a role.
That was Nathalie Tocci with Rome's Institute for International Affairs. Thanks, Nathalie. So great to have you on the show today.
Thank you.
To the Middle East now, where the UN says it needs to flood Gaza with food in order to start reversing a famine in parts of the territory. It's calling on Israel to open all border crossings into Gaza to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian aid. A limited amount of food and other supplies have been entering the Strip, but far short of what is needed.
Some aid has started moving into Gaza as part of the ceasefire deal. The UN Relief Coordinator said it was a moment of hope and the start of a new chapter.
And I want Palestinians on the other side of the gate to know that we're coming. And we're coming in force. We're coming at scale. We see you, we hear you. You've waited too long, but the trucks are moving.
Yet for most, the situation in Gaza remains desperate, with essentials either non-existent or still in short supply in the devastated territory. The World Food Programme said it's been able to move around 3,000 tonnes of food into Gaza since the start of the truce. But that's just a fraction of what's needed.
Our children aren't eating anything. Israel has closed all the borders and all the crossings, and they don't care. We don't have mattresses, blankets, tents or anything. We're stuck here. Even the aid we do receive, like the water, we can't access properly because sometimes we receive one vehicle and other days we don't receive anything at all.
Aid agencies are urging Israel to allow Gaza to be flooded with aid, as promised in the peace agreement, by opening all border crossings. Israel, for its part, is reported to have postponed the reopening of the Rafah crossing into southern Gaza. It said this was because of Hamas's failure to deliver the remains of all deceased hostages by an agreed deadline. But despite the slow start, the WFP says their plan is to scale up deliveries to reach 1.6 million people inside Gaza over the next 3 months. And that the quicker they're able to do this, the more lives will be saved.
Let's take a closer look at the situation with Abeer, Etefa, senior spokeswoman with the World Food Programme in the region. Abeer, welcome. Let's start with what you're hearing from Gaza. What can you tell us about the current situation on the ground? How much aid is coming through, and is it getting to where it's needed the most?
Well, I think the situation in Gaza, everybody knows that the food security and the hunger levels are unprecedented in Gaza. We have 500,000 people in the north of Gaza who have been in famine conditions since the IPC report or the latest food security assessment that came in August. Mm-hmm. As we speak, we've managed to get some food supplies. So there is progress. It's slow progress, but it is happening. Food distributions are starting to happen. We've started 5 food distributions. That's, at the beginning of establishing 145 food distribution sites all around Gaza. Yeah. At the same time, last night...
Yeah, the UN wants to see Gaza flooded with food. How far are we from that becoming a reality, you think?
We're still very far, but we're only a few days into the ceasefire, and there are massive challenges in terms of, clearing roads, rubble, being able to restore, some of the infrastructure so that we can have these trucks move, having all 5 border crossing points open across Gaza so that we're able to get massive food supplies inside Gaza. That is what it takes to flood Gaza with food supplies. At the moment, there is progress. It is slow, but at least we're able to send supplies. Last night, we sent 57 trucks, which made it all the way from the border crossing point in Kerem Shalom to our warehouses. For the last many weeks, we have not managed to cross and be able to drive through Gaza and get to our distribution points. We've managed to also distribute nutrition supplies in Gaza City, which is, one of the areas hardest hit by the famine conditions and extreme high levels of malnutrition. Yeah. So we're far from there. But the steps are happening. The ceasefire, the first few days of the ceasefire will always be fragile. The real test of time is going to be in the next few days, and whether we continue to have sustained access, whether things ramp up, and the level of bureaucracy, coordination, everything improves, and the border crossing points open.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that because Prime Minister Netanyahu says Israel will not compromise if Hamas doesn't fulfill the requirements laid out in the ceasefire deal. And some border crossings, namely the one in Rafah, which was a huge and very important lifeline for Gazans, it remains closed. How do you feel about aid being used as the main means of pressure on Hamas right now?
Well, that we are all, we all feel that it is important not to punish 2 million people who are hungry, who are, tired, exhausted. Some of them have returned homes to nothing, to rubbles, children deprived from food supplies. It is imperative to get the flow of food supplies in Gaza and all humanitarian supplies. It is something that is essential, and it's basically the humanitarian principles and imperative at this moment.
We've seen Donald Trump in recent days hail that he made peace in the Middle East, but the fact of the matter is that the ceasefire there is quite shaky. What would a resumption of the military campaign in Gaza mean for your operations on the ground?
A ceasefire is the only way that we can scale up and reach all the people in need in Gaza. We need this ceasefire to hold. We need to be able to move across Gaza and to get the 145 food distribution points. We need to get closer to the people. We need the markets to continue to start to operate, because we're planning, and we've already started the distribution of vouchers, because people need some of the fresh food supplies, especially the most vulnerable, the extremely vulnerable people need this close proximity and the ability to purchase supplies from markets. We're planning 200,000 people, that's 10% of the population, to have these vouchers so that they can supplement their diet. And for all this to happen, it's going to have to be a ceasefire. We've tried it every other way, and we know that it will not work unless we have, a ceasefire and a complete lull in fighting.
That was Abeer Etefa, senior spokeswoman with the UN World Food Programme. Thank you so much.
Thank you.